Good morning. My name is Malcolm Clemens Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral here in San Francisco, California. Welcome to the Forum Fall Season. We're so grateful to have Paula Nesbitt with us. She's a sociologist of religion and an Episcopal priest. She's a leading voice on issues of gender, leadership, and institutional change within the church. She spent decades researching how religion intersects with culture, especially how questions of equity, power, and professionalism play out in both local congregations and global religious communities. Her book, Indaba, A Way of Listening, Engaging, and Understanding Across the Anglican Communion, explores how a South African model of dialogue has been used to help Anglicans around the world navigate deep disagreements, not through debate, but through deep listening and mutual understanding. Today, we're going to be talking about how dialogue can transform conflict and what it means to lead with moral courage in complicated times. Paula, thank you so much for joining us today. I've been looking forward to this very much, I think for years and years. I've always had a list of questions I wanted to ask you, and now I've got my chance. So it was very kind of you to be here so early in the morning. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just the field of sociology, just what it is for people who are experts and what it is for people who have a passing knowledge. We've had a few sociologists on our program. We had Harry Edwards was on the program, and we've had a few others. But maybe you can tell us a little bit about what sociology is.
Well, I think every sociologist will have a slightly different understanding of it. For me, I think the defining question when I was a graduate student and just getting my feet wet in the field was, is society just a collection of individuals who happen to share something in common, if nothing else, geography?
Yeah.
Or is there a particular sense of cohesion, a common ground of values that holds it together? And how is one society distinct from another? And I think for me, at least, that is what has attracted me, is that question. And how do you hold together the tension of individual and personhood and expression with that sense of a common good?
Yeah, right. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just seminal figures in the history of sociology and who are the most important thinkers in the history of sociology.
Well, the nickname of the Holy Trinity of sociology is Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, particularly for sociology of religion in the area where I have focused most explicitly. For me, I have found my roots in Max Weber, who did focus on religion as a variable in human life and a very important variable and motivator, and that how some of our moral values, even if we don't practice a religious tradition, come out of a particular worldview of that tradition, and how essential that is to understand that particularity when attempting to negotiate a way forward, an ethical way forward of a dilemma.
Yeah, I wonder, maybe you can talk, maybe I'm the only one who cares about this, but the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, just his argument in that book, what life does it have today in the 21st century?
Well, I think what Weber was concerned about is that society tends to become ever more rational and bureaucratic, and that once we reach a stage where we are little more than a bureaucracy, the spiritual impulse, the impulse for change, the ability to change because of the bureaucratic mechanisms can be tamped down. And the phrase that's oftentimes used of being trapped in an iron cage of rationalism is what he was most concerned about. However, he did leave the door open for charisma, which would be, in his view, equated most with spirit, impulse, what we might call, as Christians, the impulse of the Holy Spirit, to challenge that and to create change or strive for change. I think perhaps in our culture, the most important figure in that had been Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Right, indeed. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just what sociologists are thinking about nowadays in this climate where there are more conspiracy theories have more life, where there are more like elements of irrationalism around us. In some ways, maybe it's the fulfillment of kind of the postmodern philosophies we were talking about in the latter part of the 20th century, where what is true, where we, in a sense, are less like rational and bureaucratic in our approach to things. But what are sociologists saying about kind of the current political situation?
Well, again, I've been following most sociologists of religion who've been looking at that from religion standpoint. And for me, I think it's important to remember the 1960s and 1970s. We're now in what might be a more dystopian form of what certain elements of society had felt then, particularly the spirit of civil rights and overthrowing oppression and wanting more equality. Also for young people, they felt the hypocrisy, the bureaucracy of the 1950s and wanted more free expression. And part of that was an outgrowth of the post-World War II boom in education and baby boom, of course, where students had the luxury of going to high school without having to have a job on the side or going to college where they had space to think. And especially those who chose not to go into the military service or be drafted, but got deferments where they had that extra space as young adults. So there were cults, particularly in the late 60s and early 70s, and cult meaning short for culture.
Right.
Harvey Cox used to use the phrase of that cult is a derogatory term because we never talk about belonging to a cult.
Right, exactly. I'm going to be joining a cult this week.
Yes.
Could you come and join me?
It's always somebody else's religion.
Yeah, right, exactly.
But new religions, particularly over at Berkeley, the new religious movements study, that was ground zero, where scholars came and they had quite a research think tank to study different groups, such as probably the most famous or infamous would be Jonestown and People's Temple. Not all had a dystopian end, but what they did do is to give people an opportunity to envision a different form of society. I'd say it was more hopeful then. Unfortunately, in some ways, that tended to fall apart for a number of reasons, which we could might be another forum. But I think there are analogies that we could look to for today to that movement in a different direction.
Yeah, kind of individualism is part of it, and I do think of the charismatic movements too, in kind of more established churches, and the emergence of new Christian expressions of faith too. Yeah, very interesting. So you mentioned Harvey Cox, who he was a wonderful teacher for me too. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what it was like when you first got to Harvard, and maybe some of the people who influenced you when you first arrived there.
Well, I had been in the corporate world before I went back to school. And one of the areas that I was most concerned about and really wanted to study was how different people's religious traditions informed their ethical decision-making in secular contexts, such as business. And I was working with a company that was international and focused on becoming ever more international, and quite aware that some of the assumptions we make were not the assumptions that people in other cultures might make based on their religious understandings. Yeah. And so the place that I found at that point in my life that would give me that kind of understanding was Harvard Divinity School. Yeah. When I got there, I mean, it was quite a shock. The first course that I took was in American Public Policy, and Preston Williams was teaching
he's great.
that course.
What a lovely person.
And he was talking about the Hebrew Bible and the covenant with the Israelites. And about a third of the way through the class, a Nepalese monk in a saffron robe raised his hand and said, "Professor, what is a God?" I thought, I'm glad I don't have to answer that one.
Yeah, exactly.
Later in the class, he was talking about the new covenant that Jesus had given us of, love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. And Sunanda raised his hand again and said, "Professor, what is love?" Again, I thought, I'm glad he's answering that, not me. And then at the end of the class, just before we were getting ready to leave, Sunanda raised his hand again and said, "Professor, how can a God love?" I thought, I'm going to learn something.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, I love that story.
And that was, especially going to an interreligious context like that, it's challenging because you ask yourself the very fundamental questions of what do I believe? Why am I Christian? Why am I Episcopalian? Yeah. There's also a lot of experimentation, but it gives an understanding by listening to one another at a very deep level that, for me, seemed to go down to the core.
Yeah, it's interesting to think of your work with bringing people together for the sake of listening as having its roots in that experience of being in an environment where we're people from around the world with different religions. I wonder if you can talk about some of your favorite teachers who were there or teachers that you really influenced your thought.
Well, I'd say the person that I studied with the most and really helped me to understand more deeply religious experience and also relationship to one another is Richard R. Niebuhr.
Oh, yeah, Dick.
I took a number of his courses and really valued what he said and how he interpreted a number of thinkers, particularly in the history, of Christianity.
Yeah, he was my doctoral advisor, but my biggest regret, my academic regret, is I didn't take Kant, Coleridge, and Schleiermacher that class. So I don't even know how to reconstruct that now. But I think part of what I appreciated about his thought was just that emphasis on feeling, on emotion, as being something that gives us information about who we are and our place in the universe too. But what a wonderful teacher. I miss him very much. I remember being at his house in Arlington when, doing my oral exams and, congratulations, Dr. Young, or whatever they say to you. He was like, asked such great questions about, our work. Well, tell us a little bit about, I want to talk a little bit about the ordination of women. I just think that's an important part too. You've studied the ordination of women and just the effect that it has on the church and on society. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what you learned in studying that topic.
Well, first of all, I think that it was important to realize that women had different agendas for seeking ordination. Yeah. And especially the first ones, the first group, there seemed to be part of a common ground of wanting to change the church. Yeah. Some wanted to go more into pastoral work. Others wanted to go into more what you might call parish ministry and moving up into the church hierarchy to be able to influence decision making. The common ground that I found among all of them is that their movement and their desire for ordination wasn't for self-interest alone, that it was always, there was a sense of being able to open a door for others.
Yeah.
And that seemed to be the driving purpose that they had, was to be able to open the church for other women who had something important to contribute.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I think of Carter Hayward and Frederica Tomsad at EDS. I mean, we knew them, and that's exactly what motivated them. I mean, they had a sense of higher idealism, that a dream that the church would be transformed by women being more fully participating in it.
And part of it, if you aren't visible at the table,
Yeah.
and if your voice isn't allowed to be heard in decision making, others won't be aware that one exists. And so part of it was being able to be part of a larger conversation, so to speak, in convention terms, as far as putting ideas out there, seeking to make change, critiquing when injustice was present that sometimes people might not be aware of. And so that was very important. And also, several have written that women's ordination and opening it, the church to women also opened it to people in all demographic areas. That it was no longer a closed society, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think so that women were first admitted to the legislative body of the Episcopal Church in 1970. Is that right? At sometime around then. But it did change everything right from the beginning. And I think you're right. We're more open to other kinds of differences and other kinds of people too, as a result of that.
Well, also, we tend to forget Phyllis Edwards,
yeah, right, exactly.
who was commemorated last week.
Yeah, completely.
When Bishop Pike recognized her. She was a deaconess, and he recognized her ministry as being within the diaconate. And that was also part of some of the conversations with the House of Bishops over the role of deaconesses. Were they deacons or not?
Right.
I mean, in their ministries. And so he recognized her in 1965, and that she then was the first woman to be recognized as ordained clergy in the church. That's, of course, set off a furor and controversy that I argue really pushed forward the ordination of women as a priority.
Yeah, I mean, I would have loved to have been there in the Chapel of Grace. I've seen a few of the photographs of the occasion, and yeah, what an extraordinary set of personalities that we had, that made that possible. So the first women who were ordained, what was their ministry like, and then how has that changed? Like, how are women who are being ordained in the year 2025? How is their experience different than the women who were ordained in the 1970s?
Well, the first women were ordained at the diaconate because in 1970 there was a resolution at General Convention to open ordination to all holy orders to women. It passed in the House of Bishops. Yeah. It passed by the laity. It failed by the clergy. Yeah. The women who were ordained as deacons, so what they settled on, the amendment was that women could be ordained at the diaconate. Yeah. So they were ordained, and they did have diaconal ministries in parishes, in diocesan offices, and elsewhere. Some were paid, some were not. Yeah. And many of the women, not all, but many saw that as a step eventually towards ordination to the priesthood. That's where they felt called.
Yeah.
And so we're quite familiar with the struggle of the Philadelphia 11 and then the Washington 4 and then the opening of women's ordination. During the 70s, it was very difficult for women to get positions other than as a parish assistant or associate.
Yeah.
For a woman to be a priest in charge or an interim, a vicar, or much less a rector was very rare. Today, that is fortunately much more egalitarian, particularly for women coming in their first job or two, that it's very open and gender really does not make a significant difference. However, as they move in their ministry over the years into other positions, there is data that the Church Pension Fund collects, and it still shows, sadly, that women tend to move into rectorships in smaller parishes where there are few resources. Oftentimes, they may need to be putting out the Sunday bulletin themselves,
Right.
and paying the bills to keep the lights on, because they can't afford to have an administrator, which unfortunately for many does take away that time that they might be wanting to do more pastoral care or to build programming for the congregation or work in the community. For women to get into positions where they have a staff and that they have the resources to be able to do abundant ministries in the community is still quite a challenge.
Yeah, definitely. I wonder if you can talk about the first woman that you met who was an Episcopal priest.
The first woman I met her name was Sally Shippen.
Oh, yeah, right. I
And
remember Sally Shippen.
in the Diocese of Oregon, which
Yeah.
is where I was at the time. I was a confirmed layperson working in the corporate world, had absolutely no interest in ordination whatsoever.
Yeah.
And my first thought was, but of course.
Yeah, it makes total sense once you see it.
Partly because I had been in the era of women coming in to be the first in this job or that job in the corporate world. And so my colleagues and I were very aware, of that sense of breaking fresh ground and that the world did not fall apart.
Yeah.
In fact, we added some dimensions that really was synergistic in many ways. And so Sally Shippen did represent that to me as someone who was rightfully there and should have been there all along and was really, again, opening doors for people to see new possibilities.
Yeah, we were lucky. We had, I met Mary Goshert when she was first ordained, and Suzanne Guthrie was someone who I met like not long after she was ordained, and yeah, it was really good. I think it helped people to envision what the future would be, and I do think bodies of people make better decisions when men and women are equally represented in those bodies. And I can't imagine coming up with good results and restricting the input of the people who are have a voice in that discussion. And then your own calling to ordination, how did that start to come out? What was your process for getting ordained, and how did you decide to do this?
Well, as a priest, friend, and turned out mentor said, I went in kicking and screaming.
That's great. I love
He said
that.
he did too, and it's
Yeah.
amazing the number of people I know where that has been their frame of reference as well.
Yeah.
When I was at Harvard Divinity School, I was there to study business ethics. I was a confirmed layperson, that's where I was going.
Yeah.
Until one day I realized I was terrified of ordination. And I realized that I needed to discover what that terror was about. And a lot of it had to do with the anxiety that the collar would inhibit my sense of expression and my sense of freedom. And it was only when I realized that, yes, once you put on a collar, you may speak for yourself, but you also speak for a tradition to other people who will see that, and there's a sense of trust that you have been endowed with, and that is an accountability as well. So that if you do say something that's personal, you need to be very clear that it's your own belief or nuance it in relation with the wider church. I mean, if it's part of a controversy that's ongoing, that's a little different than if you come up with a theological understanding that is completely opposite to, where the church is.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think I don't feel it as a restriction so much because my personality and my nature is kind of like that anyway. But I can imagine it would be like some people would feel like a restriction, like you said, on your sense of freedom, that you cannot be completely who you would be without it. But I love that. That's really interesting. So when you were ordained, and then when did you start working on just kind of like women's roles in church and women in religion? When did you start doing that as an academic interest?
Well, when I started my PhD midway through my master's program at the Divinity School, and I started the PhD in the Yard in the sociology department at Harvard.
Yeah.
So I was doing both degrees at once. And when I got to take my comprehensive exams in sociology, after the exams, I was informed that my committee would be disbanding, that the chair of my committee, my advisor, was being reallocated to the psychology department,
Really?
and the two other faculty members did not get tenure. One, even though he had written 5 books.
Oh my goodness. That was Harvard, though. Bernadette Bruton, did you know her? She's
Yes,
like the smartest person I ever met, and she didn't get tenure. I was so disappointed. I'm still disappointed, like 30 years later. So what did you do?
Well, I couldn't pursue the topic that I wanted to pursue, which had to do with what we started talking about in the corporate world, about people from different religious traditions and how they negotiate secular decision-making with that sense of being informed. Right around that time, the Bhopal disaster hit.
Yes.
And the communications director from Union Carbide was a good friend of mine. And we were in conversation because I was at school at the time. And what became clear was that when you were essentially negotiating compensation for the loss of life, the meaning of life for us in the West and the meaning in the life for a largely Hindu population have very different meanings.
Yeah.
And how do you compensate for that? And unless one understood that there was even a difference, the conversation was simply passing the night, and that's in many ways what happened for so long. That they finally arrived at something, but it was not, a mutually agreed upon, win-win situation for both, as you could have any kind of win-win in that kind of a disaster. The problem was that I had nobody to study with.
Right.
Because they were all
Well, that's
gone.
exactly what happened to me. I moved to Harvard to study one thing, and the person who I was going to be my advisor moved to Cambridge University in England, and it totally changed my life and what I studied. So then, what did you do?
Well, I thought, and I also had to make a decision, like within a week.
Yeah. Oh.
And so I thought the only other thing that I could think of where I really felt a passion was the study of women's entry into ordained clergy in different denominations, and how is that going to change those denominations?
Yeah.
How is it going to change the church? In what ways, or was it? And so that was the path that I took, and I was able to find people between the Divinity School and the sociology department to work with. My favorite was David Reisman, who in his 80s was still coming to campus and had an office.
Yeah.
And he was convinced that I was going up the elevator while the building was burning down. But he was intrigued with what I was doing and really lent his full support to it.
Yeah, it's funny because I remember people in the 70s talking about the feminization of the church in a very negative, with a very negative connotation. And that's the title of your book. It turns out to be a totally different kind of thing. But I wonder what would you say to people in the 70s who were, concerned that they were going to lose something that they really cared about because women were going to be part of the church?
I think it's important to realize that sometimes we need to be bold.
Yeah.
And where people are working for justice, there's going to be change.
Yeah.
And there needs to be some grieving, because change also means becoming reacquainted and readjusting and looking for the value that comes, and not just stay with the loss. Part of that negative ethos, and it's still with the concept, is the fear that men would come in, or women would come in, and men would leave the church. And since women were the majority of the lay volunteers, and in the pews, the majority, there was a very strong concern that men would just be gone. So that it would not be a greater inclusion, it would just be a switching out. They also felt, particularly the clergy tension, was that women's presence would depress salaries and depress the prestige of the occupation.
Wow, I never thought of that at all.
And that was what my dissertation was focusing on, is looking at the history of male clergy ordained from 1920 on and the trajectory of their careers to show, and I was surprised, I wasn't expecting to find it, that the changes is both the decline of the number of men in relation to the openings and their opportunities began in the 1960s, much about the time when church attendance had peaked and began a slow and then more rapid decline. But particularly in the 70s, with more young people being educated and having more career options, for those who weren't drawn to the ministry for its intrinsic, what it had to offer, they could make a lot more money in other professions and occupations.
That is so interesting. That is so interesting. Earlier, I mean, I don't even know how to articulate this, but there was a way in which I look at my predecessors at every place that I've been, and they had this kind of power and authority, and I remember at one church you'd get a heraldgram, and what it means is you did something wrong on the altar guild, like the candlestick holder wasn't in the right place on the altar, and you'd write this, and it was a very different ethos in terms of just like, how do we work with each other, how do we treat each other. I knew another woman who is one of my mentors, Kitty Lehman, who is one of my mentors, and she'd been pinched by a rector of a church in the diocese, like pinched like on her bottom. That world, like there's no way I could function in that world. I would not be as effective as those men were. But man, they just wouldn't fit in our world either. And I do think, that's a silly way of describing how the church has changed. But for me, it's like a really deep feeling of being a kinder place, like less competitive, less people butting heads or arguing in a more civil way. All of that. It feels like so much better place to be.
Well, for me, the insight that I had at the 1998 Lambeth Conference was I was there to interview a number of bishops around our church and around the communion on their thoughts around the emergence of the first 11 women bishops to be at Lambeth. And I remember one interview with one of our Episcopal bishops who said that he really looked forward to their presence and to their leadership style, which might create a fresh opening and a fresh sense of role models of how that men's leadership was expected. He said it's very difficult to create change among your peers, but women coming in give an opportunity for a more collaborative leadership style, which he was ready to embrace, given the opportunity.
Yeah.
And he said there are several like me as well. And so the more open the episcopate is, the more opportunities there will be to develop a range of leadership styles and not have to conform to one expectation.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I hadn't even thought about that. So it's really kind of converging of two forces. One is, we didn't have women who were bishops in previous Lambeth conferences. So this is the first one where you would have women leaders. And then at the same time, you also have the internet, which means that, what we're all doing is much more obvious to other people in other sections of the world. And I wonder if you can describe a little bit about what it felt like at that 1998 Lambeth conference. So a Lambeth conference happens once every 10 years. It's a gathering of all the Anglican bishops in the World Communion, and that's kind of the setting. So here's the one that has the first 11 women. What did it feel like to be there for that?
Well, we had a prayer vigil under a tree, and there were women from different parts of the communion were there. Some, particularly from the Church of England, and Australia.
Right, and women had only been ordained in England since 1994. So for 4 years, that's what the context was. That it was so new for them.
And their campaign was for women in the episcopate as well,
exactly,
to open all
allowed
orders.
To be in the bishops. Yeah.
But we prayed, and some male bishops came, and we prayed for the women bishops who were there, that they would be surrounded by people who cared and compassion.
Wow.
And we were also quite surprised, and among my interviews, that's one question I asked of, what was the reception that they saw to the women? It seemed to be largely a non-issue.
Oh, good.
There were occasions where a few male bishops might leave the room or leave their group, but there was no overt hostility.
Yeah, that's good.
Partly because that particular conference some had come with a strong political agenda, and their energy and attention was elsewhere. And so in a way that women were somewhat under that radar. The people who would have perhaps made a fuss were more focused on another issue.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just your role with Anglican Communion, the bishops, and then just kind of like the beginning of Indaba too, and then obviously you'll tell us what Indaba means.
Okay. The 1998 Lambeth Conference, of course, that was where, it was explosive on the issue of human sexuality, particularly homosexuality. What I discovered, and I was not prepared for that explosion to happen in the way that it did. I was picking up that there were tensions, but I, as well as many of our own bishops in the church, had thought that it would be a reasoned discussion, maybe a little passion on the floor, plenary floor, but nothing like what happened as far as the negativity, the hostility that was displayed. It was very clear as a sociologist after 1998 that we could not have another Lambeth Conference like that with resolutions, plenary sessions, and voting. That was absolutely critical because it had become a political circus.
So it's like a legislative approach, and you were like looking for another option that's not like going to be just legislating everything.
And the conferences originally had begun as a place of informal discussion. When anything that was, there was no legislation, but as that moved in, it had no significant value except moral persuasion. Because one church cannot tell another what to do, or the communion cannot tell our church.
So you can vote all you want. We're going to do, we're still,
It's like family.
It is. But you're right, we just have shared interest, and we might have a conversation about what does it mean to go into World War II as a communion, and how's this going to affect each of our different areas of the communion.
So between 1998 and 2008, a design group had been formed to try to come up with something that would not just reproduce what happened at 98, because they were convinced that it would be the end of the Anglican Communion if that happened. And I was one of several people who were invited to put some sociological input on that. And we were pretty much of a similar mind. But it was Archbishop Thabo Makgoba who would later take Archbishop Desmond Tutu's position and succeed him. He was on the design group, and they didn't have a method or a process for a different kind of Lambeth Conference. And so he offered Indaba, which was a word out of his own Zulu tradition. And that word in English, the closest you can come, is called respectful gathering. When traditional communities would have a disagreement or some kind of a conflict that was threatening the community, they would go into Indaba. And the leaders would listen to every person in the group who had a stake in the issue. And the listening was trying to understand the issue from their position. What the leader might think about it was irrelevant in the moment, but it was just trying to get that understanding. And the philosophy, which is so different from us in the West, is that you never had all the pieces on the table to make a wise decision until you had heard and understood the situation from everyone's perspective. Only then could you find a way to collaboratively move forward. And so Indaba was used at the Lambeth Conference rather than the voting. They did have some plenaries for teaching, for discussing, but there was no vote, no position papers. It was largely broken into groups where people could listen to one another and what they, from their own context, what they thought. One example that I thought was so touching from some of the interviews I did with bishops afterwards was one in talking about human sexuality and particularly there were some bishops in the Indaba, a couple who were ordaining gay men and lesbians and were blessing their unions. One of the African bishops said, in my culture, my people see what you do as just as if I had done it myself, because we are in relationship. There is no separation between us. And so I am held accountable for what you are doing. And it was a real insight into part of the resistance, into why there was such resistance. On the other hand, other bishops had said for the first time they were able to ask and hear how some of our Episcopal bishops were moving forward as a matter of their spiritual sense of justice. And they could hear it from a spiritual standpoint, not just a behavioral standpoint. At the end of the conference, one of the summative statements was that our minds may not have been changed, but our hearts were changed. And they were able, at that point, to commit to walking together, even while the differences remained. And so that was a huge turning point. And what that did do, that process, is it really separated those who had goodwill, who wanted to stay together, from certain factions and certain leaders outside that had strong interests in breaking apart the communion.
Interesting.
Or wanting to take it over for their own interests. And so that the collective, even if we disagree, if we find the common ground of staying together, we do have the power to overcome those voices that would want to break us apart.
Yeah, that was the most powerful thing. I remember that section in the book where he said that whatever you do is exactly as if I had done it myself. And just the feeling of that. And I can imagine just being in the room as you come to this realization about, his commitment to our connection and how important that is. One of the traditions we have on the forum is we take questions from our audience. And so Rebecca Nessel has the question cards, so she'll have questions for us. And she can bring them up. So I this is like the most obvious question. I thought of it like when I first thought of you coming on and talking about this. But this is a method for listening, and I wonder if you can talk about just how you might apply Indaba to like the Congress, the U.S. Congress. Like how might we change? Because you're right. It was an interesting observation that some people do. It is in their self-interest to break apart the republic. But how would you introduce Indaba, like for our American politicians and statesmen, or statespeople?
I suspected that question might be coming.
I knew. It's like the most obvious thing in the world. Everybody's crossing out the question because they all ask the same question, probably.
The biggest issue is goodwill.
Yeah.
In traditional communities, and Indaba from the Zulu tradition has its parallels in a number of indigenous communities, including our own indigenous communities, where there may be sacred circles or other ways.
Yeah, in Hawaii, it's called ho'oponopono. Yeah, which I figure you knew all about because it's Indaba for Hawaiians.
But there is a strong sense of community, of wanting to stay together if it's all possible, because one doesn't just pick up one's things and walk out and join another community, because other communities may not want them.
Right.
And likely won't want them and may see them as traitorous. So there's strong coercive pressure to work out one's differences in a way that one can continue. Our culture is so individualistic that oftentimes you will see that when people don't agree, they walk. Mentally, they walk, and sometimes physically. And that is also, there has to be a sense of wanting to stay together and wanting to hold together. And divisive forces can be their most effective when they take differences and seek to polarize them into, black and white, global north, global south, one party or another party, rather than realize that there is a spectrum both within these and a large place in the middle, that nothing is that clear, but you cannot effectively do battle, so to speak, unless you've got clear lines. And that's what's happening now, is those factions that have no will to the common good have strong interests in creating this polarization in hopes that their side will win. Well, in the end, neither side totally wins. But that's where I think the healing needs to happen in Congress. It's going to take either electing more independents who aren't under the hold of one or the other to create some kind of middle ground. Or it's going to take those for whom alliances, and this could be either party, their alliances don't cohere with their own moral values. And they take courage collectively to stand. That power is there. It's a matter of them deciding to stand in solidarity. As Carter Hayward said in a presentation last spring, these are difficult and dangerous times, but we need to say and do something, but not alone, that there is power and safety in collectivities.
Yeah, that sounds it's so important. And Carter Hayward, what an important voice for our time to remind us of that moral imperative of respecting and caring for each other's dignity. So, say the chaplain of the Congress called you and said, there's been some interest in setting up Indaba in Congress. How would you do it, and what would it look like? Because we didn't really talk very much about what the listening process actually practically looks like if you were to walk into the room and there are all the senators sitting. How would it be set up, and how does it feel when you're in that setting?
Well, I think it would need to be done. If it were done today, it would need to be done within each party. And it would need to be done, Indaba isn't just like all of one party sitting around and listening, that's part, but also in small constituency groups, which they have. To be able to talk personally, to talk candidly in what may be a relatively safe space. And then to bring the fruits of that into a larger group and a larger group. And also, again, to think about what is the best for the common good. And how do they want a common good? Do they want another Congress to survive?
Right.
And if so, this is the time that they have to make those tough decisions, because it's not going to get easier next year. And so part of it is to listen, to understand, to try to come up collectively with decisions that none of the individuals themselves might think of, which is what happens with Indaba when it's used.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so we're starting to gather some of our questions. This first question is, how do you see the Episcopal Church's role in leading a national conversation on public service and the common good, a la Bishop Buddy?
I think she has done a marvelous job with her book, Learning How to Be Brave, and that's being adopted for use in congregations, for social justice.
Yeah.
I think the House of Bishops recently, after this last meeting in the Dominican Republic, issued a statement about the importance of standing up for justice and for those who are being marginalized, who have no voice and are being disinherited. They're wisely trying to stay out of being too political, even though supposedly, we're given that freedom. Freedom isn't always what we should exercise in certain moments. But I think it's important for people to read and to take to heart that message, is that this is important for people in their congregations, in their dioceses, to stand up and to do what they feel called to do. Whether it is supporting people who are being oppressed, marching, if that is it, even just serving, compassion is a way to be able to create a kinder, gentler, and more effective common good.
Yeah, and I think the Episcopal Church really is part of that story of how we learn to live with each other and care for each other. And you're right. I think the experiences that the Anglican Communion has gone through, that the Episcopal Church has learned from, will have an effect on how our society is too. Yeah. Here's another question: how do we create will for the common good, where we cannot see it and are comfortable walking alone and not together when differences remain?
Well, the comfort for walking alone, in a free society that strives for justice, even though justice is not perfect, there is that privilege. But in a society that is not free, where justice is eroded and taken away, and where people never know what's going to happen next, including whether one's going to have a job, one's going to have a lifestyle that is similar to what one has, walking alone is not going to be possible.
Yeah.
If we continue down this path, our society is going to change markedly. And in some ways, our individualism, our rugged individualism, is going to have to do some introspection of creating that sense of balance so that one can be an individual in a community that respects individualism. Or are we going to focus on creating a society and working together and giving up a little bit of that so that we can hold together?
Yeah. Okay, here's our next question. Can you share a moment when your ability to extend goodwill in a discussion was tested, and how did you navigate that?
Yes. I'd say probably right now, like so many people, it's very difficult to listen to what we don't want to hear. Particularly to listen to people who we care about, who may have strong differences of view that are antithetical to everything we stand for. People who may be long-standing friends or extended family members, or even nuclear family members. That, I think, is the hardest. The easy way is to gloss over and just not talk about it. And in some ways, there is value to that in buying some time. But some other times when you get trapped into a conversation, it's hard, but it's so important to just take a deep breath and in some ways just to let them talk. Because oftentimes when people have strong views and it's coming out of an emotional place, they're not going to be reasoned with. Yeah. Or we aren't when we're speaking out of something that's coming from a very deep place. Usually there are deeper concerns than the position, and I love Roger Fisher and William Urey's book, Getting to Yes, that came out 40 years ago, about how we negotiate interests rather than positions. And I think that's a piece of wisdom for all of us in when someone has a position with which we disagree, try to set aside the position and dwell into their interests. What is their interest in this? Yeah. What is underneath it? What is motivating them to hold this position? That's what Indaba does in that context, but it's something that we can do in our culture very simply. Yeah. Because oftentimes when people's interests are able to be discussed, we can find common ground. We can find empathy for where they're suffering or where they're hurting. And that is where the healing needs to begin. We're not going to heal on the positions themselves or the surface. Yeah. But for each and every one of us, particularly when we feel that something is threatening or hostile, to try to diffuse it a bit and help people start to talk about their interest in it. Yeah. And what is going on, what has led them to this. And I suspect that you will find that people really do like to talk about that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think in some ways that when you're as you're talking, I just think of a sense of being respected is this deep need that we have, and I think it's if you get right down to the bottom of it, I think that that impulse is central to like a lot of what we see around us, and things are changing in terms of just. We live in a much more unequal society. People have fewer opportunities in terms of their work and their career. I think there's just a lot of ways people feel belittled, diminished, disrespected, and maybe that's that bottom level that we aren't talking very much about, but which is the driving force in what we're seeing all around us.
When we listen, and listen in a deep way, in an open way, without judgment, it's a way of showing people our respect. Yeah. In our culture, we value speaking more than listening. We listen to figure out what people are saying, where we might find holes in their argument, and we might counter them, or to extract information. Yeah. But oftentimes when people are speaking, it may not be, what they're saying may not be represented well in the words they're choosing.
Right.
And the more we can give people space to speak and just to listen for what are the deeper meanings and what does it mean to them, it's giving them a respect for their personhood, for their being, and that they may not have had the opportunities that we have had or experiences, but they have something to contribute. Yeah. And the challenge is to listen deeply enough and to ask the right questions so that comes up. And for them, that's a tremendous gift to be able to articulate something of value. Yeah. And for us, we have an understanding and a respect that we might not have had if we just stay on the surface of listening to positions and debating.
Yeah. Well, we've kept you too long, I'm afraid. We went over time, and what I'm worried about is that we have to get you upstairs to preach and prepare for your sermon. But it's been so good to have part of this conversation. It's so timely and so important. And I love that. I'm going to go sleep tonight. I'm going to imagine you doing Indaba with all the senators. So please join me. Oh, yeah, thank you. Please join me next week when my guest will be Professor John Powell, an internationally respected expert in the area of civil rights, racial identity, fair housing, poverty, and democracy, and director of the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley. We're going to be talking about the bridging that helps us communicate, coexist, and imagine a new story for our shared future where we all belong. You're always welcome to join us for Choral Eucharist at 11 o'clock. We rely on your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. There are many ways to give, including texting the word THINK, T-H-I-N-K, to 76278. And Paula Nesbitt, thank you so much for being here today and inspiring us for the future.
Thank you.